Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 38. He doesn't know what to do. As hard as he has tried, he has been unable to acquire intelligence regarding the locations of the remaining Hydra bases. Those he does know about are simply too large for any one man, even one with his abilities, to assault on their own. Perhaps it is time to report back to his CO, but he can't, not with the mission incomplete, and he can't reach out to this Steve Rogers, who looks nothing like the skinny boy he sometimes remembers. He can't be Bucky Barnes when he no longer knows how. He is somewhere in Eastern Europe. He speaks the language, knows the customs, though he can't recall how he has learnt them. It is as good a place as any to hold up, to stop fighting and start figuring out what everything he scribbled in his notebooks means. That thought alone frightens him. "Daddy, I don't want you to go!" Jamie said. He was leaning in close, speaking softly, as though suddenly uncomfortable with the idea of anyone hearing him. Tony wasn't sure if it was a growing older kind of thing, or a just watched his father being strangled by a teammate thing, but it was almost as heartbreaking as the utterly lost look in Jamie's eyes as he stared at Tony imploringly. "I'm so sorry, buddy," Tony said, reaching out and smoothing some of Jamie's wild hair out of his face. "I gotta go, though, or Skynet's gonna do a lot of damage. That guy is a computer. I have to go and help." Eddie knew more about vibranium than any of the rest of them. He knew enough about it that Claw's involvement and his obvious past with Wakanda rubbed him in all the right ways, setting off every danger instinct he had. The others, though, were mostly convinced that going after Claw was a wild goose chase. Tony was half convinced Steve had only backed his play to follow that hunch in order to double-check that Claw didn't have any of Tony's weapons lying around. One thing that was pretty certain, though, was that chances were the others weren't going to go to Africa at all if Tony didn't push it. Coming along himself, unfortunately, was part of that pushing it. And if he was right, and he was almost certain he was, they were going to need him. "Take me with you, then!" Jamie said, and he was all wide eyes and jutting bottom lip, and it was almost physically painful to deny him anything. "I'm sorry, kiddo," Tony said, reaching out and pulling Jamie close, squeezing him in a long hug. "You can't. I need to know you're safe, or all I'm going to be thinking about is protecting you, and then I won't be able to fight nearly as well. I need you to be safe. Can you do that for me?" After a long time, Jamie swallowed with an audible click. He nodded. "Hey, Miss Jarvis," he said softly. "Oh, sweetheart." Tony pressed a kiss to the side of the kid's head. "I do too." He took a deep breath. "I love you, all right? I gotta go now." Jamie nodded, eyes still too wide, more than a bit too wet. "I love you too, Daddy," he said. Tony forced a smile for the kid's sake before walking towards the door. He stopped just outside Jamie's door, shut it behind himself, and turned to look at Il. "You get him out of here and take him somewhere safe," he said. "You don't tell anyone where you've gone. If I get him back in anything less than mint condition, you'll wish all I did was WikiLeaks you." "I already said I would," she said, voice sharp and irritated. Then her eyes seemed to soften. "He'll be all right no matter what. I promise." A small, frail smile stretched her face. "Now go save the world." Sometimes Tony hated being right. Still, for a few minutes, he did suffer the delusion that it wasn't all as bad as he'd feared. Ultron and the Maximoffs hadn't managed to get away yet. There was still a chance to stop them and retrieve the vibranium, and fuck, Tony still didn't want to even begin to try to find out what Ultron wanted vibranium for. Ultron, dry and humorless, did not give them any information to work with. The Maximoffs did not follow Steve's dream script and come in quietly, and just like Tony had known since the moment they entered the ship, it all exploded into an all-out three-sided battle. Well, technically it was three-sided, at least for the first bit, but quite frankly, Claw and his man did so pathetically they barely counted. Tony tried his best to stay focused on his own little corner of the battle, but he lost Ultron again and again, had to pause to take out his robot followers. It hurt like hell to still recognize some of them as Iron Legionnaires. And then there was everyone else! Tony had been getting used to being on a team, but it was still difficult. It split his attention, which was already caught somewhere between himself, his opponent, and the civilians around him. Thankfully, there at least weren't any of them here, or Tony would have been fucked with the sharp corners and narrow passageways and the disturbing messages coming through. rockets everywhere, and so many distractions, so many damn things to worry about. There may not be any civilians, but there were still his teammates, and Tony still hadn't figured out how the fuck he was meant to deal with how frightened he sometimes got on their behalf. "Stay down, kid!" Steve was saying. Tony figured he was talking to one of the Maximoms, and he hoped like hell the twin listened. They might not be children, the two of them, but they were still pretty damn young, and clearly extremely misguided. Tony would very much prefer it if they came out on the other side of this unscathed. Unless they continued to prove themselves threats. Then he had no idea what the fuck would happen, or even what should happen. Obviously, Bruce had heard the chaos going on as well. "Guys," he called, "is this a code green?" He sounded quite a bit more agitated than Tony would have liked, and shit, but he did not need more distractions right now. Bruce would stay in control. He had to. Tony needed to be able to count on that. "Thor!" Steve was shouting. "Status!" Tony gritted his teeth and focused on repulsoring the hell out of the robot in front of him. He almost wanted to turn off the comm. He didn't have Jarvis to assist him this time, and God, but that thought still hurt. Tony couldn't even imagine a future where it wouldn't hurt, which made the suit that much harder to use. He needed his head in the game, needed all his attention on his immediate opponent. "The girl tried to warp my mind!" Thor said, and Tony's breath caught. For a moment, his attention faltered entirely, and he had to suck in several sharp breaths, barely dodging a direct attack. Why was he reacting so badly to the mention of mind warping or mental control? It wasn't like it had ever happened to him. Had it? He couldn't help but remember that weird-ass vision. Far clearer than any dream he'd had, crisper than his most detailed panic-induced delusion. But no, she hadn't. Couldn't have. Could she? "Take special care," Thor continued. "I doubt a human could keep her at bay. Fortunately, I am mighty." And yet the longer he spoke, the more slurred his words became, the more he fell into those Shakespearean speech patterns Tony thought they managed to train him out of. He sounded shit-faced. Tony's instincts flashed warning signs all over the place. Something was definitely wrong with Thor. Some kind of mindfuckery that his gut told him clearly was very bad. To be honest, there was a part of him that questioned why he gave a fuck. It had been barely 24 hours since Thor took it upon himself to fucking strangle Tony in front of his kid. The apology had seemed sincere, sure, but still not quite enough to warrant this level of concern. Maybe Tony should just fly over, make sure Thor was still on his feet. The two of the robots came up from behind and tackled him, and Tony was almost grateful for the distraction that allowed him to not think about his teammates for a moment. Natasha and Steve weren't speaking on the comms. Not too unusual with Natasha, sure, but Tony was the only person speaking more on the comms than Steve, usually. You should check up on Clint, too, although Clint was another one who was mostly silent during missions. Still, something clanged against the helmet, and Tony winced, turning back to his more immediate problems. "I've done the whole mind control thing," Clint was saying. "Not a fan." There was a clatter, and then, "Yeah, you better run!" Tony breathed a sigh of relief. Seemed that whatever the Maximoms had been up to, it was under control for now. Thankfully, Barton's brain didn't always exhibit signs of being bird-sized. "Whoever's standing, we gotta move!" Clint continued. No one was checking in. "Clint!" Tony heard himself. "Something's really fucked up about all this." He turned in the air with a grimace, grabbed two robots by their throats, and slammed them together until their heads were little more than crushed metal and smashed circuits. He dropped them and moved on, belatedly wondering if the heads were really the most important thing to destroy here. No, it had to be. Ultron was still building his minions based on human physiology. Tony had to believe he could count on that. "Quinjet's still secure," Bruce said. "I think I'm hearing something outside, though. I'm gonna go check." "Bruce, don't!" Tony began, but he could already hear the telltale sign of the ramp lowering on the other end of the comm. "Fuck," he muttered, and none of the others were checking in. This was going all the way to hell in a handbasket really fucking fast! Tony got his eyes on Ultron again. Heart pounding, he followed him out of the ship, only to watch another robot flying away with the vibranium. Tony gritted his teeth and sent a unibeam at what had been serving as Ultron's main body before speeding off after the one with the vibranium. "Uncle Bruce!" Someone called over the comms, voice high and childish and faint like background noise. Against any bit of good sense he had, Tony felt himself start to slow down. Then he shook his head as if to dislodge the wool that had suddenly settled between his ears. He took off again, pushing more power into his foot thrusters. "Uncle Bruce!" The voice shouted again. "I don't," Bruce was saying. "Who are you?" "Johanne!" Another voice, female and strongly accented, shouted. "Johanne, get away from him! He's a monster!" That word alone tore at Tony. People might use it for Bruce more often, but really, it always was a punch in the stomach to hear things like that. Probably worse yet for Bruce, but nothing. He had to focus on the mission. He had to. "No, he's not!" The child voice. Johanne shouted. He's my Uncle Bruce and he won't hurt me. I won't let you hurt him either. Uncle Bruce, take me back with you. Please. Take me away. Tony pulled up short, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he was aware that the vibranium was moving further and further away, further and further out of reach. Right now he couldn't bring himself to care. As though compelled by some kind of biological imperative, he turned around and sped back toward the Quinjet. The Maximoff twins were there, but Tony wasn't afraid, was barely even aware of their presence. He stepped out of the armor and towards Bruce and the child clutching at his sweater. The little girl turned around and stared at him with large, round, disbelieving brown eyes. His own eyes, like staring at a fucking mirror. "Daddy!" the girl said, and then she was letting go of Bruce's sweater and rushing towards him, running far faster than he'd have thought a little kid could have managed. She launched herself at him with enough force to send them both tumbling to the ground, but all Tony could do was wrap his arms around her and hold her tight and breathe her in as the whole world seemed to fall away around them. He had to force himself to keep on breathing, had to fight to hold back the tears. "I'm here, Maria," he whispered, voice cracking. "Daddy's here, sweetheart."